The stagecoach wheels kicked up dust that spiraled into the setting sun as Grace Keller clutched her valise with white knuckles, her heart pounding against her ribs like a frightened bird. Dallas, Texas, 1876, a place she'd fled to with nothing but desperate hope and the clothes on her back. Escaping one nightmare only to face an uncertain future in a town where she knew not a soul. The driver called out as they approached the town limits, jarring Grace from her worried thoughts. She adjusted her bonnet to shield her face and the fading bruise around her left eye. No one needed to see that, not in her fresh start. Dallas bustled with activity even as dusk settled. Cowboys mingled with businessmen, saloon girls called from balconies, and horses tied to hitching posts stomped impatiently. The stagecoach pulled to a halt outside the Dallas Grand Hotel, a two-story building that was anything but grand despite its name. "End of the line, folks," the driver announced, jumping down to help passengers disembark. Grace stepped down carefully, her worn boots landing in the dusty street. She had exactly $23 to her name, all that remained after purchasing the stagecoach ticket from St. Louis. It would have to be enough until she found work. "Miss, you need help with your bags." A young boy, no more than 12, looked up at her expectantly. "No, thank you," she replied softly. "I can manage." One valise was all she had, and she couldn't spare a penny. The hotel lobby was modest but clean, with a stern-faced clerk who barely looked up as she approached. "Rooms 50 cents a night, paid in advance." Grace swallowed hard. "I'll take 3 nights, please." That would give her time to find work and more permanent lodgings. She handed over $1.50, feeling the weight of each coin as it left her palm. The clerk pushed a key across the counter. "Room 8, top of the stairs, end of the hall." The room was small but private, with a narrow bed, washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. Grace set down her valise and sank onto the bed, finally allowing her shoulders to slump. She was safe for now, but tomorrow she would need to find work. A respectable position, not like the saloons she'd passed on her way in. She would never allow herself to be at a man's mercy again. She unpinned her honey-brown hair, letting it fall in waves down her back, and gingerly touched the yellowing bruise around her eye. Vernon's last gift before she fled in the night. Her husband of 3 years, whose charming facade had crumbled on their wedding night. "Never again," she whispered to herself, a promise that gave her strength. Dawn came too quickly. Grace dressed in her best, a simple blue calico dress with only one mended tear at the hem, and pinned her hair into a modest bun. She carefully applied a bit of rice powder to conceal the last remnants of her bruise. Dallas in daylight was even busier than the evening before. She walked purposefully down the main street, noting potential places of employment. The general store looked promising, as did the small seamstress shop. She had a fair hand with a needle, though her skills weren't professional. The bell above the door jingled as Grace entered Harrison's General Mercantile. A middle-aged woman looked up from behind the counter, assessing Grace with sharp eyes. "Good morning," Grace said politely. "I'm inquiring if you might need help in your establishment." The woman's expression softened slightly. "My husband does the hiring. He's out back unloading supplies. You can wait if you like." Grace nodded gratefully and stood by the counter, watching customers come and go. A mother with 2 small children purchased flour and sugar. A young cowhand bought tobacco and ammunition. An elderly gentleman selected hard candies with careful deliberation. "Martha, where did you put those new ledgers?" A deep voice called from the back room. "On your desk, Harrison, where they always go." The woman replied with a hint of fond exasperation. She turned to Grace. "That's my husband. You can go on back and speak with him now." The storeroom was filled with crates and barrels, and a tall man stood examining a clipboard of inventory. He looked up as Grace entered, revealing a weathered face with kind eyes beneath a shock of silver-streaked dark hair. "Mr. Harrison, your wife said I might speak with you about employment." He studied her for a moment. "We're not actually hiring at present, Miss Keller." "Grace Keller," she supplied, trying to hide her disappointment. "I understand. Thank you for your time." "Wait," he said as she turned to leave. "You new to Dallas?" "Yes, sir. Just arrived yesterday." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. The Prescott Ranch, about 3 miles north of town, was looking for a cook and housekeeper. Old Mrs. Prescott passed last winter, and they've been making do since then. Might be worth inquiring. Hope flickered in Grace's chest. "Thank you. I'll do that." "Stagecoach makes a run out that way on Tuesdays and Fridays. That's tomorrow. Could save you the walk." Grace thanked him again and left the store, her spirits lifted. A ranch position might be ideal away from town, with room and board typically included. She'd grown up on a small farm in Missouri before her marriage, so the work wouldn't be unfamiliar. She spent the rest of the day inquiring at other establishments, but no one was hiring. By late afternoon, her feet ached and her stomach growled with hunger. She allowed herself to purchase a simple meal at a small cafe, calculating her remaining funds with care. The next morning, Grace boarded the stagecoach bound for the northern ranches. The driver, a grizzled man named Wilbur, seemed to know everyone's business. "Prescott Ranch, eh?" he said when she told him her destination. "Good outfit. Old man Prescott's gone now too, died 6 months after his wife. It's the son running things now. Hayden Prescott. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair by all accounts." The ranch came into view after an hour's journey, a sprawling property with a large main house, several outbuildings and corrals filled with horses. A bunkhouse stood a respectful distance from the main house, where cowhands would live during the season. Wilbur pulled the stagecoach to a stop in the ranch yard. "Good luck, miss," he said as she stepped down. "I'll be back through on Friday if things don't work out." Grace nodded her thanks and walked toward the main house, summoning her courage. The door opened before she reached it, and a man stepped onto the porch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair beneath his Stetson and a face tanned by the sun. His features were strong, a square jaw covered in stubble, straight nose, and eyes that seemed to look right through her. "Can I help you, madam?" His voice was deep but not unfriendly. "Mr. Prescott, I'm Grace Keller. I heard in town you might be in need of a housekeeper and cook." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn but clean dress and the small valise in her hand. "News travels fast," he finally said. "Come inside and we can talk." The house was well built but showed signs of neglect, not dirty exactly, but lacking a woman's touch. Curtains hung unevenly, furniture needed polishing, and dust had gathered in corners. "Coffee," he offered, leading her to the kitchen. "No, thank you." Grace remained standing, not wanting to appear too forward by sitting without invitation. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a chair at the large oak table. He poured himself a cup of what looked like hours-old coffee and sat across from her. "So, Mrs. Keller, miss," she corrected automatically, then felt her cheeks warm. "It's Miss Keller now." His eyebrow raised slightly, but he didn't comment on the distinction. "Miss Keller." "What brings you to Dallas?" "A new beginning," she answered honestly. "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Prescott. I can cook, clean, sew, and help with garden work if needed. I grew up on a farm in Missouri." "Any references?" Grace hesitated. "No, sir, not here." She couldn't exactly ask Vernon for a character reference, and she'd been forbidden from maintaining friendships during her marriage. He seemed to consider this, taking a sip of his coffee before grimacing at the bitter taste. "Can't be worse than what I'm drinking now," he muttered, then looked back at her. The position includes room and board plus $20 a month. It's not easy work. This is a working ranch with 6 hands in the bunkhouse and sometimes more during roundup. You'd be responsible for all household duties and cooking for me and occasionally the foreman. $20 a month plus room and board was more than fair. Grace nodded eagerly. I'd be grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Prescott. When can you start? Immediately, if you'll have me. He seemed to make up his mind. There's a room off the kitchen that was Mrs. Garcia's. She helped my mother before she got too old to continue. It's yours if you want it. He stood, indicating their discussion was concluded. I should warn you, Miss Keller, I'm not much for conversation. I expect meals on time and the house kept in order, but otherwise, I'll stay out of your way. That sounds perfectly acceptable, Mr. Prescott. In fact, it sounded like heaven to Grace work to do, a safe place to stay, and a taciturn employer who would leave her be. He showed her to a small but clean room with a narrow bed, dresser, and window that looked out toward the distant hills. Get settled. Then perhaps you could see about some dinner. The pantry should be stocked. I was in town for supplies yesterday. Grace unpacked her meager belongings, changed into her work dress, and set about exploring the kitchen. The pantry was indeed well stocked, though organized with a man's haphazard logic. She found good cuts of beef, potatoes, carrots, flour, and spices enough to make a hearty stew and fresh bread. By the time Hayden returned from the barns, delicious smells filled the house. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, watching as Grace set the table. Smells good, he said, removing his hat. Haven't had home cooking since. He trailed off, a shadow crossing his face. It's been a while. They ate in relative silence, but Grace noticed him take second helpings of everything. She considered it a victory when he murmured his thanks after finishing. The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Grace rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, then spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house that had clearly been without a woman's touch for too long. Afternoons were for baking, mending, and preparing dinner. Hayden was gone most days from dawn till dusk, working alongside his men, returning only for meals and to sleep. He wasn't unfriendly, but he kept his word about staying out of her way. Their conversations were brief and practical, mostly concerning meals or household matters. Sometimes in the evenings, he would sit at the kitchen table going over ledgers while she baked or prepared things for the next day. They worked in companionable silence, and Grace found herself relaxing in his presence in a way she hadn't been able to with a man in years. As spring progressed toward summer, Grace settled fully into her role. The house transformed under her care, curtains washed and properly hung, furniture polished and arranged more comfortably, floors scrubbed until they shone. She planted a kitchen garden with herbs and vegetables, and added touches like wildflowers in simple jars on the tables. Hayden noticed. He never commented directly, but she would sometimes catch him looking around with appreciation in his eyes. Occasionally, he would bring her small things from town, a new paring knife when he noticed hers was worn, a bolt of cheerful fabric that now served as kitchen curtains, a jar of honey from a neighboring farm. One evening in early June, Grace was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard shouting from the corral. She looked up to see several ranch hands gathered around something, their voices urgent. Without thinking, she dropped her basket and hurried over. Hayden was kneeling beside a young ranch hand who lay in the dirt, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. The boy, he couldn't be more than 19, was pale with pain, trying manfully not to cry out as Hayden examined the injury. "What happened?" Grace asked, pushing through the men. "Bronk threw him against the fence," Hayden answered grimly. "Legs broken bad." Grace knelt opposite Hayden. "I need clean cloths, whiskey, and 2 straight pieces of wood for splints," she ordered, surprising herself with her authoritative tone. The men scattered to fetch what she needed. "You know what you're doing?" Hayden asked, looking at her with new interest. "My father broke his leg when I was 16. Doctor was 2 days' ride away." She gently felt along the boy's leg, murmuring apologies when he winced. "It needs to be set before we move him." When the supplies arrived, Grace soaked a cloth in whiskey and gave it to the boy to bite down on. "This will hurt," she warned him. "Mr. Prescott, I need you to hold his shoulders." Hayden nodded, positioning himself at the boy's head and gripping his shoulders firmly. Grace took a deep breath, positioned her hands on the leg, and with one swift, sure movement, pulled and manipulated the bone back into place. The boy's scream was muffled by the cloth, and he passed out from the pain. Working quickly, Grace cleaned the area where the bone had broken through the skin, then bound it tightly between the wooden splints. "He needs a doctor," she said, sitting back on her heels and wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Doc Jensen's in town." "I'll ride for him," Hayden said, already standing. "The men can carry the boy to the bunkhouse." "No," Grace countered. "He shouldn't be jostled that far. Bring him to the house. The front parlor has a sofa long enough for him to lie flat." Hayden looked like he might argue, then nodded. "Jenkins, fairly gentle as you can," he instructed 2 of the burlier hands. To Grace, he added, "I'll be back with the doctor as quick as I can." Grace supervised as the unconscious boy was carefully transported to the parlor sofa. She sent one of the hands for clean linens and another for water, then set about making the patient as comfortable as possible. By the time she had him settled, Hayden was already galloping down the road toward town. It was nearly midnight when Hayden returned with Dr. Jensen, a gruff older man with capable hands and a kind manner. He examined the break, then looked at Grace with approval. "You did a fine job setting this, madam. Couldn't have done much better myself. Clean break. Should heal well with proper rest." He administered laudanum for the pain and left additional doses, then gave instructions for care that would last several weeks. After the doctor left, Grace prepared a late supper for Hayden, who looked exhausted from the long ride. He sat heavily at the kitchen table, accepting the plate she set before him with a grateful nod. "The boy, Tommy, he'll be staying here until he can be moved safely," Hayden said between bites. "Hope that won't be too much trouble for you." "Of course not," Grace assured him. "I'll look after him." Hayden paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "You're good in a crisis, Miss Keller. Not many would keep their head like that." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. "My mother always said a level head saves more lives than flapping hands." "Wise woman, your mother." He finished his meal in thoughtful silence, then stood to leave. At the doorway, he turned back. "Thank you, Grace." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in his voice made her look up sharply. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Then he nodded once and was gone, leaving Grace with an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. The next few weeks brought changes to the household routine. Young Tommy remained in the parlor, unable to be moved to the bunkhouse with his injured leg. Grace cared for him alongside her regular duties, changing bandages, bringing meals, and keeping him entertained with books and conversation during the long days of recovery. Hayden checked on the boy daily, often sitting with him in the evenings to play checkers or simply talk. Grace would hear their laughter sometimes as she worked in the kitchen, a pleasant sound that seemed to warm the house. She noticed Hayden lingering more often now, coming in from his work earlier, finding reasons to be in the house when previously he'd stayed away until mealtimes. Sometimes she would look up from her work to find his eyes on her, thoughtful and warm, before he quickly glanced away. One afternoon in late July, Grace was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when Hayden entered, his shirt soaked with sweat from working in the summer heat. "I thought you might like this," he said, placing a small package on the table. "Saw it in the general store yesterday." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and opened the brown paper to find a beautiful bone-handled hairbrush with delicate floral engravings on the back. "Oh," she breathed, running her fingertips over the smooth surface. "It's lovely." "But why?" Hayden shifted uncomfortably, his hat in his hands. "No particular reason, just thought you might like it." Grace was touched by the gesture. It had been years since anyone had given her a gift simply for the pleasure of it. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's perfect." He nodded, seemingly embarrassed by her gratitude, and quickly changed the subject. "Tommy's doing better. Doc Jensen says he might be able to move back to the bunkhouse next week." "That's wonderful news," Grace replied, though she would miss the young man's cheerful presence in the house. "He's been a good patient." Hayden lingered, watching as she returned to kneading the dough. "My mother used to bake bread every morning," he said unexpectedly. "The smell would wake me up, even before the rooster." Grace smiled, pleased by this rare personal revelation. "My mother taught me to bake when I was 8, said a woman who could make good bread would never go hungry." She was right. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Your husband was a fool to let you go." Grace's hands stilled in the dough. She had never spoken of Vernon to Hayden, never explained the Miss Keller now that she'd uttered in their first meeting. "What makes you think he let me go?" she asked carefully. Hayden's eyes held hers steadily. "The way you flinch sometimes when someone moves too quickly near you. The way you kept your head down when you first arrived, like you were trying to be invisible." His voice was gentle but direct. "And the fading bruise around your eye that you thought your bonnet hid when you stepped off that stagecoach." Grace felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't since arriving at the ranch. "I don't," she began, then stopped, unsure what to say. "You don't owe me any explanations," Hayden said quickly. "I just wanted you to know that you're safe here. No one will harm you on my property." The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet certainty, brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. She blinked them back, focusing on the dough beneath her hands. "Thank you," she managed to say. Hayden nodded once, then left her to her work. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of her past, that somehow made her feel not more vulnerable, but more secure in his presence. That evening, Grace used the new hairbrush, marveling at how smoothly it glided through her long honey-brown hair. She wondered at Hayden's gift, at the growing warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. It both thrilled and frightened her. She wasn't ready to trust a man again, wasn't sure she ever would be, but Hayden Prescott wasn't Vernon. In the months she'd worked for him, he'd never raised his voice to her, never made demands beyond the agreed-upon duties of her position. He respected her space, her privacy, and now, it seemed, her past. As summer blazed on, the ranch grew busier with preparations for the fall cattle drive. More hands were hired temporarily, meaning more meals to prepare and more laundry to wash. Grace rose earlier and worked later, but never complained. The work was honest and satisfying, and Hayden always made sure she had help when the load grew too heavy, usually assigning one of the younger hands to haul water or chop extra firewood. Tommy eventually moved back to the bunkhouse, but often stopped by the kitchen for extra biscuits or just to chat. Through him, Grace learned more about Hayden, how he worked alongside his men rather than just giving orders, how he paid fair wages and treated everyone with respect. "Boss man's different since you came, Miss Grace," Tommy told her one day as she packed him a lunch for fence-mending duty. "Smiles more. Even heard him whistling last week." Grace busied herself wrapping cornbread, hoping Tommy wouldn't notice her blush. "I'm sure that has nothing to do with me." Tommy just grinned knowingly and tipped his hat before leaving with his lunch pail. August brought a terrible heat wave that left everyone short-tempered and exhausted. The cattle grew restless in the scorching fields, and the ranch hands worked in shifts to keep them watered and as comfortable as possible. Grace kept a large pot of lemonade ready at all times, and the men stopped by the kitchen regularly to refresh themselves. She worried about Hayden, who seemed to take the longest, hottest shifts himself, unwilling to ask his men to do what he wouldn't. One particularly brutal afternoon, Grace filled a jug with cold lemonade and carried it out to the far pasture where Hayden was working. The sun beat down mercilessly as she made her way across the dusty ground, her bonnet providing scant protection against the heat. She found him mending a broken section of fence, his shirt soaked through with sweat, face red from exertion and sun. He looked up in surprise as she approached. "You shouldn't be out in this heat," he said, straightening from his work. "Neither should you," she countered, pouring lemonade into a cup and offering it to him. "At least drink something before you collapse." He accepted the cup gratefully, draining it in one long swallow before holding it out for more. "Thank you. I didn't realize how thirsty I was." Grace refilled his cup, noticing how the heat had burned his face and neck despite his hat. "You should come back to the house for a while, at least until the worst of the afternoon heat passes." He shook his head. "Fence won't fix itself, and the cattle need to be moved to the creek pasture before sundown." But he swayed slightly as he said it, revealing his exhaustion. "Mr. Prescott Hayden," Grace said firmly, using his given name for the first time. "You'll be no good to your ranch if you suffer heat stroke. Please just rest for an hour." Something in her tone, or perhaps the use of his name, made him pause. After a moment he nodded. "An hour," he conceded, gathering his tools. They walked back to the house together, the silence between them comfortable despite the oppressive heat. In the kitchen, Grace poured more lemonade and prepared a cold lunch of leftover chicken, bread, and pickled vegetables. "Eat," she instructed, setting the plate before him. "Then you should lie down for a while." To her surprise, he didn't argue, just ate quietly while she bustled around the kitchen, preparing dinner for later. When he finished, he stood somewhat unsteadily. "Perhaps you're right about that rest," he admitted. Grace insisted on walking him to his bedroom, concerned by the slight stumble in his usually sure steps. His room was stifling hot, the afternoon sun beating directly against the windows. Without thinking, Grace opened the windows and pulled the curtains, creating a dim, slightly cooler space. "Sit," she instructed, pointing to the bed. She left briefly and returned with a basin of cool water and a cloth. "Take off your shirt." Hayden raised an eyebrow at the command, but complied, revealing a torso tanned and muscled from years of physical labor. Grace tried to keep her expression professional as she dipped the cloth in the cool water and began to bathe his face, neck, and shoulders. "You're burning up," she said with concern, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. "Feels good," he murmured as she pressed the cool cloth to the back of his neck. His eyes closed, face relaxing under her ministrations. Grace continued bathing his heated skin until the water in the basin warmed. "Lie down now," she said softly. "Rest. I'll wake you in an hour." Hayden obeyed, stretching out on the bed with a weary sigh. Grace picked up the basin to leave, but his hand caught hers gently. "Thank you, Grace," he said, his voice low and intimate in the dim room. She nodded, suddenly unable to speak, and slipped from the room. In the hallway, she pressed her free hand to her racing heart, trying to understand the feelings stirring within her. Concern for his well-being, certainly, but also something more, something that frightened and excited her in equal measure. An hour stretched into 2 as Grace allowed Hayden to sleep, knowing his body needed the rest. When she finally went to wake him, she found him already sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling his boots back on. "I overslept," he said, looking up as she entered. "You needed it," she replied simply. "How do you feel?" "Better." He stood, reaching for his shirt that hung on the bedpost. "Thank you for your care." "It's nothing you wouldn't do for any of your hands," Grace said, keeping her eyes averted as he dressed. "It's not the same," he said quietly. When she looked at him questioningly, he added, "My concern for them is a responsibility. My concern for you is—" He trailed off, seeming unable to find the right words. The air between them grew charged with unspoken feelings. Grace felt herself drawn toward him, even as warning bells sounded in the back of her mind. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard and a voice calling Hayden's name. He moved to the window, looking out with a frown. "It's Jenkins. Something must be wrong with the herd." He finished buttoning his shirt and strode past her. "I have to go." Grace nodded, relieved and disappointed at once by the interruption. She followed him downstairs and watched from the porch as he mounted his horse and rode off with the ranch hand, their figures quickly disappearing in a cloud of dust. That night, Grace lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, replaying the moment in Hayden's bedroom, wondering what he had been about to say. His concern for her was what? Different, special. She was afraid to hope, afraid to trust the warm feelings that had been growing inside her for months now. Vernon had seemed kind too, in the beginning. He had courted her properly, charmed her parents, and made her believe he would cherish her always. The transformation after their wedding had been swift and terrible, the first blow coming on their wedding night when she'd innocently displeased him. 3 years of increasing isolation and abuse had followed, until the night he'd threatened to kill her and she'd finally found the courage to flee. How could she trust that Hayden was different? That the kindness and respect he'd shown were genuine and lasting, yet her heart, so carefully guarded for so long, wanted to believe. Hayden Prescott was nothing like Vernon Marsh. Where Vernon had been charming and sociable in public, but cruel in private, Hayden was reserved in public, but gentle in his personal dealings. Vernon had isolated her from others. Hayden encouraged her friendships with Tommy and the other hands. Vernon had belittled her abilities. Hayden praised her skills and trusted her judgment. Still, fear lingered. Once burned, twice shy, and she had been more than burned. She had been shattered and had painstakingly put herself back together during her months at the ranch. Could she risk that hard-won peace? The cattle incident kept Hayden away for 3 days, as he and the hands moved the herd to safer pastures ahead of an approaching storm. When he finally returned, exhausted and mud-splattered, Grace had a hot bath waiting and a hearty meal keeping warm on the stove. His gratitude was evident in his eyes as he sank into his chair at the table after bathing and changing into clean clothes. "You're a godsend, Grace Keller," he said simply, tucking into the stew she placed before him. "It's my job," she replied with a small smile. "Is it your job to know exactly what I'd need after 3 days of hell?" he asked, looking up at her. "To have hot water ready without being told and my favorite meal waiting." Grace busied herself cutting bread to hide her pleasure at his words. "Perhaps I'm just observant. Perhaps you care," he suggested quietly. She looked at him then, meeting his steady gaze. "Perhaps I do," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. The smile that spread across his face transformed his features, softening the lines of weariness and making him look younger, almost boyish. "Good," he said, "because I care too. More than I should, probably." Grace's heart thudded in her chest. "Hayden," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. "I know you've been hurt," he said, his voice gentle. "I know someone made you afraid. I don't expect anything from you, Grace." I just wanted you to know that I care about you not as my housekeeper, but as a woman, a remarkable woman." Tears pricked at her eyes and she blinked them back. "I don't know if I can," she started, then stopped, frustrated by her inability to express her conflicted feelings. "You don't have to know now," Hayden assured her. "I'm not going anywhere and neither are you unless you want to. We have time." His understanding touched her deeply. "Thank you," she whispered. The days that followed took on a new dimension. Outwardly, little-changed Grace continued her duties, and Hayden his. But there were new undercurrents in their interactions. Lingering glances, brief touches when passing items at the table, conversations that stretched longer into the evenings. Hayden began finding small ways to court her, properly and respectfully. He brought her wildflowers he'd gathered while checking the north pasture. He carved a beautiful wooden spoon for her kitchen from a piece of cherry wood. Once, returning from town, he presented her with a book of poetry, remembering she'd mentioned enjoying verse. In turn, Grace found herself opening up more, sharing stories from her childhood and asking about his. They discovered shared interests in music, nature, and surprisingly, astronomy. One clear night, Hayden invited her to the hill behind the house to look at the stars, naming constellations his grandfather had taught him. "My father wanted me to study law," he confided as they sat on a blanket, gazing upward at the vast Texas sky. "But I couldn't imagine being confined to an office when all this was here." He gestured at the expansive land around them. "You belong here," Grace agreed, seeing how naturally he fit into this wild, beautiful landscape. "This ranch is part of you." He looked at her, his face silver in the moonlight. "It used to be enough," he said softly. "The land, the cattle, the work. Now I find myself wanting more." Grace's heart quickened at his words and the look in his eyes. He reached for her hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. She didn't. His fingers entwined with hers, warm and strong, and they sat in comfortable silence under the stars, connected by that simple touch. As September arrived, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and preparations for the fall roundup, Grace found herself falling into an easy companionship with Hayden that felt both comfortable and thrilling. They still maintained proprieties. He was her employer after all, and appearances mattered in 1876 Texas. But in private moments, there was a growing tenderness between them that gave Grace hope for possibilities she had long since abandoned. One evening, Hayden returned from town later than expected, his expression troubled. Grace had kept dinner warm and she served him quietly, sensing his preoccupation. "Is everything all right?" she finally asked when he'd barely touched his food. He looked up, seeming to come back from far away. "Just business matters, nothing for you to worry about." But his tone suggested otherwise, and Grace frowned. "I'd like to think we've moved beyond you keeping troubles from me, Hayden. If something's wrong, I'd rather know," he sighed, pushing his plate away. "There's talk in town. A man's been asking questions about a woman who matches your description. Arrived by stagecoach in the spring, possibly took work outside town." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "Vernon," she whispered, her hand flying instinctively to her throat. Hayden nodded grimly. "Your husband, I presume." "Ex-husband," Grace said fiercely, though legally that wasn't true. She had simply fled with no formal dissolution of their marriage. "How did he find me?" "He may not have yet," Hayden reassured her. "The description was vague and Dallas sees many travelers. But if he's looking this far south—" "He won't stop," Grace said, rising from her chair and pacing the kitchen. "He told me once that if I ever left, he'd track me to the ends of the earth, that I belonged to him forever." Her voice broke on the last word. Hayden stood, moving toward her but stopping short of touching her, respecting her space in her moment of panic. "Grace, look at me," he said firmly. She forced herself to meet his eyes, finding strength in his steady gaze. "You don't belong to anyone but yourself," he said with quiet conviction. "And as long as you choose to stay here, you have my protection. No one will take you from this ranch against your will. I promise you that." The fierceness of his declaration both comforted and frightened her. "I won't have you putting yourself in danger for me. Vernon he's violent, Hayden. Dangerous when crossed." "So am I when necessary," Hayden replied, his jaw set in a hard line. "But let's not borrow trouble. He may never find this ranch, and if he does, we'll handle it then. Together." Together. The word warmed her despite her fear. She nodded, trying to push down the terror that had risen at the mere possibility of Vernon finding her. That night, Grace double-checked the lock on her bedroom door before going to bed, a habit she'd abandoned months ago in the safety of the ranch. She lay awake for hours, starting at every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind outside her window. When she finally fell asleep, her dreams were plagued by Vernon's angry face, his hand raised to strike. She woke exhausted, moving mechanically through her morning tasks. Hayden noticed immediately when he came in for breakfast. "You didn't sleep," he observed, concern evident in his voice. "I'll be fine," she assured him with a weak smile. "Just need to keep busy." He didn't push, but throughout the day, she noticed ranch hands positioned closer to the house than usual, and Hayden himself stayed nearby, working on tasks that kept him within shouting distance. His protective instincts touched her deeply, even as she prayed they would prove unnecessary. 3 days passed with no sign of trouble. Grace began to relax slightly, hoping Vernon's inquiries in town had led him elsewhere. Perhaps he'd given up, finally accepting that she was gone for good. Then, on the 4th day, she looked up from hanging laundry to see a cloud of dust on the road leading to the ranch. A single rider, approaching fast. Grace's heart pounded as she dropped the sheet she was hanging and ran toward the barn where Hayden was repairing tack. "Someone's coming," she said breathlessly. "Just one rider." Hayden immediately set aside his work and strode out to see for himself. "Could be anyone," he said reasonably. "A messenger from town, a neighbor, a potential buyer." But his hand rested on the revolver at his hip as they watched the rider draw closer. As the figure became clearer, Grace felt herself begin to tremble. Even at a distance, she recognized the set of those shoulders, the way he held himself in the saddle. "It's him," she whispered, unconsciously stepping behind Hayden. Hayden's posture changed subtly, feet planted more firmly, shoulders squared. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Stay out of sight, but where you can hear if I call for you." Grace hesitated, torn between hiding and standing her ground. "Hayden, please, Grace. Let me handle this first." She nodded and retreated to the house, positioning herself near the window where she could see and hear what transpired in the yard. Vernon Marsh rode up to the hitching post and dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself in control of any situation. He was handsome in the conventional way that had first attracted Grace, tall and well-dressed, with regular features and carefully combed dark hair. But she now saw what she had missed during their courtship, the coldness in his eyes, the cruel set of his mouth. "Afternoon," Hayden greeted him neutrally. "Something I can help you with?" Vernon looked around, taking in the well-kept ranch with an assessing eye. "Perhaps. I'm looking for someone, my wife. She left our home in St. Louis some months ago. I've tracked her as far as Dallas and heard she might have found employment at one of the outlying ranches." "A lot of ranches around Dallas," Hayden replied, his voice giving nothing away. "What's her name?" Grace Marsh." Vernon's smile didn't reach his eyes, though she might be using her maiden name, Keller. About so high, honey-colored hair, green eyes, Pretty little thing, but confused. She's not well, you see, needs to come home where I can care for her properly. Grace's hands clenched into fists at the familiar lies. How many times had Vernon told neighbors and acquaintances that she was delicate or confused to explain away her increasing isolation, and the occasional visible bruise? Outside, Hayden's expression remained impassive. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description. Most of the ranches hire through town, though. You might have better luck asking at the employment office there. Vernon studied Hayden's face, clearly searching for signs of deception. Mind if I water my horse before heading back? It's a hot day for riding. Pump's over there, Hayden said, gesturing toward the water trough. Help yourself. Vernon led his horse to the trough, positioning himself so he could see the main house clearly. His eyes scanned the windows and Grace ducked back, heart hammering. Had he seen her? She heard footsteps on the porch and then the front door opening. Hayden entered, his expression grave. He doesn't believe me, he said in a low voice, and he's looking too interested in the house. He'll want to search it, Grace whispered. He won't leave until he does. Hayden nodded. I thought as much. We have two choices. I can refuse, possibly leading to a confrontation where someone could get hurt, or I can face him, Grace finished. Show him I'm not afraid anymore and that I'm never going back. I'll be right beside you, Hayden promised. He won't touch you. Grace took a deep, steadying breath. The thought of confronting Vernon terrified her, but hiding wouldn't solve anything. If he was determined enough to track her this far, he wouldn't stop now. All right, she said, straightening her spine. Let's get this over with. They walked out onto the porch together. Vernon had finished watering his horse and was tightening the cinch, preparing to leave or appearing to. When he looked up and saw Grace, his face showed first surprise, then a satisfied smile that chilled her blood. Grace, he said, his voice honeyed with false concern. Thank God I've found you. I've been so worried. Hello, Vernon, she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. You've had a wasted journey. I'm not coming with you. Vernon's smile tightened. Don't be ridiculous, darling. Of course you're coming home. You're my wife. Not anymore, Grace said firmly. I left you, Vernon. I'm never coming back. Vernon's gaze flicked to Hayden, then back to Grace. His expression darkened. I see. You found yourself a new protector. How quickly you forget your vows, Grace. I remember my vows, Grace replied, her voice stronger now. And I remember how you broke yours the first time you raised your hand to me. A husband should love and cherish his wife, not terrorize her. Vernon's pleasant facade dropped completely, his face contorting with anger. You ungrateful whore, he snarled, taking a step toward the porch. After everything I did for you, that's far enough, Hayden interrupted, his hand moving to his gun. Miss Keller has made her wishes clear. I suggest you respect them and leave. Vernon stopped, assessing the situation with calculating eyes. Miss Keller, is it? You do realize harboring another man's wife is against the law, as is adultery, which I can only assume you've been committing out here, isolated as you are. How dare you, Grace gasped, genuinely offended. Mr. Prescott has been nothing but a gentleman and a fair employer. A gentleman who just happens to keep my wife in his home, Vernon scoffed. The sheriff might have some questions about these arrangements. The sheriff knows me well, Hayden replied coolly, and he knows my reputation. I doubt he'd put much stock in the accusations of a man who beats women. Vernon's face flushed with rage. You have no right to interfere in matters between a man and his wife. The law is on my side. The law doesn't give you the right to abuse her, Hayden countered. Now I've asked you politely to leave. I won't ask again. For a tense moment, it seemed Vernon might escalate the confrontation. His hand twitched toward his hip, where Grace knew he carried a small derringer. But a quick glance around revealed two ranch hands who had appeared nearby, casually holding rifles, and Hayden's steady hand on his own weapon. Vernon's sense of self-preservation won out. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at Grace. "You're still my wife under the law. I'll be back with the sheriff and proper papers." "Do what you feel you must," Hayden replied. "But understand this, she stays here of her own free will and leaves the same way. If she ever chooses to go, I won't stop her, but neither will I let anyone force her." Vernon glared at them both, then mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. "You'll regret this," he spat, wheeling his horse around. "Both of you." They watched in silence as he galloped away, dust billowing behind him. Only when he was out of sight did Grace realize she was trembling violently. Her knees buckled, and Hayden caught her arm, supporting her. "Let's get you inside," he said gently, guiding her to the kitchen where he helped her into a chair. He poured her a glass of water, then sat across from her, giving her space to collect herself. "Thank you," she said when she could finally speak, "for standing with me." "Always," he replied simply. The single word held such conviction that fresh tears sprang to her eyes. "He'll come back," she said, voicing her fear. "Probably with legal papers. He's right that under the law I'm still his wife." Hayden reached across the table to take her hand. "We'll face that if it happens. There are lawyers in Dallas who might help, especially if you're willing to testify about the abuse, and if legal means fail." He trailed off, then looked at her with determination. "I meant what I said, Grace. You're free to choose your own path. If that path leads away from here to ensure your safety, I'll help you get wherever you need to go." The thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Hayden, made Grace's chest ache. "This is my home now," she said softly. "I don't want to run anymore." Something flickered in Hayden's eyes, hope, perhaps, or relief. "Then we'll stand our ground together." For the next week, the ranch operated under an unspoken state of alert. Hayden arranged for one of the hands to ride to town daily for news and to check if Vernon had indeed gone to the sheriff. Extra men were assigned to watch the road, and Grace never went far from the house alone. But as days passed with no sign of Vernon or legal intervention, they began to hope he had given up his pursuit. Perhaps he had realized that forcing Grace to return would mean constant vigilance to keep her from fleeing again. Gradually, life returned to its normal rhythm. Though Grace noticed, Hayden seemed more protective than before, and more open with his feelings. He no longer hesitated to take her hand or touch her shoulder in passing. In the evenings, they often sat together on the porch, watching the sunset and talking of everything and nothing. One such evening, with the sky painted in spectacular shades of orange and pink, Hayden turned to her with unusual seriousness. "I've been thinking about what Vernon said about the law being on his side regarding your marriage." Grace tensed. "Yes, there might be a way to challenge it." "On grounds of cruelty." He hesitated, then continued. "I spoke with a lawyer in town yesterday. He said with evidence and testimony you might be granted a divorce." Hope bloomed in Grace's heart. "Truly, even though I left," Hayden nodded, "it wouldn't be easy and it might take time. But it's possible." He took her hand, running his thumb over her knuckles. "You deserve to be free of him, Grace, truly free." The tenderness in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. "Why are you doing all this for me?" she asked softly. Hayden looked at their joined hands, then up into her eyes. "Because I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since the day you set Tommy's leg without flinching. Certainly since the day you brought me lemonade in the far pasture and ordered me to rest." Grace's heart soared at his words, even as fear tugged at her. "Hayden, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I don't expect you to feel the same. After what you've been through, I understand if you never want to love a man again." "But I do," Grace whispered, surprising herself with the admission. "Love you, I mean. It terrifies me, but it's true." The joy that spread across Hayden's face was like sunrise breaking over the plains. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth spiraling through her. "I would never hurt you," he vowed. "I would spend every day trying to make you happy if you'd let me." "I believe you," Grace said, and realized she truly did. In all their months together, through all their interactions, Hayden had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. He had earned her trust gradually, patiently, without demands. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, Hayden leaned toward her. Their lips met in a kiss so gentle, it brought tears to her eyes, a kiss that promised safety, respect, and a love she had once thought impossible to find. When they parted, Hayden rested his forehead against hers. "When you're free," he murmured, "when there can be no question or shadow over us, I want to ask you properly to be my wife. Not because I think I own you, but because I want to build a life with you as equals." Grace cupped his face in her hands, overcome with love for this man who understood so perfectly what she needed. "Yes," she whispered. "When I'm free, my answer will be yes." The legal process of seeking a divorce began the following week. Hayden accompanied Grace to Dallas to meet with the lawyer, who took detailed statements about Vernon's abuse. It was painful for Grace to recount those years, but Hayden's steady presence gave her strength. Witnesses were sought: neighbors from St. Louis who might have suspected the abuse, the doctor who had treated her accidents. In the meantime, life at the ranch continued. October brought the fall roundup with all its chaos and exhausting work. Grace found herself cooking for twice the usual number of hands, rising before dawn and falling into bed long after sunset. Hayden was equally busy, often returning so late she had to leave his dinner warming on the stove. Yet despite their fatigue, these were happy days. Their love, acknowledged now and growing stronger, gave them both a joy that made even the hardest work seem lighter. They were careful to maintain propriety. Grace was still technically a married woman, and gossip could damage her divorce case. But in private moments, they allowed themselves the sweet comfort of holding hands, sharing gentle kisses, and dreaming of their future together. November arrived with a sudden cold snap that sent everyone scrambling to prepare for winter. Grace knitted scarves and mittens in the evenings while Hayden read aloud from books they both enjoyed. It was during one such cozy evening that they heard horses approaching, multiple riders, coming fast. Hayden was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "Stay here," he instructed, reaching for his gun belt, but before he could buckle it, the door burst open. Vernon stood there, flanked by three rough-looking men Grace had never seen before. All were armed. "Evening, Prescott," Vernon drawled, his eyes cold with triumph. "Hope we're not interrupting anything indecent." Grace rose shakily to her feet. "What are you doing here, Vernon?" "Reclaiming what's mine," he replied. To his companions he added, "That's her, my wayward wife." Hayden moved protectively in front of Grace. "You're trespassing, Marsh. Get out of my house." "Actually, I have legal authority to retrieve my wife," Vernon said smugly, producing a document from his coat pocket. "Signed by a judge in St. Louis. You're the one with no legal standing here, Prescott." Hayden didn't take his eyes off Vernon. "Grace, go to my room and lock the door," he said quietly. "She's not going anywhere except with me," Vernon snapped. "Boys, get her." Two of the men started forward, but Hayden's gun appeared in his hand with lightning speed. "The first man who touches her dies," he said, his voice deadly calm. Everyone froze, Vernon's face contorted with rage. "You'd risk killing for her, a woman who's nothing to you legally." "She's everything to me," Hayden replied steadily. "And yes, I would." The standoff stretched for a tense moment. Then Vernon smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "All right, Prescott, have it your way. We'll let the law settle this properly." He gestured for his men to back off. "But understand this, she leaves with me tonight, one way or another. How much blood gets spilled in the process is up to you." Grace looked around desperately. Where were the ranch hands? Then she remembered most had ridden to the south pasture that morning to check for strays before winter set in. They wouldn't return until tomorrow. "Vernon, please," she tried, stepping out from behind Hayden despite his attempt to keep her back. "This doesn't need to end in violence." "So you'll come willingly?" Vernon asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "No," Grace said firmly. "I'll never willingly return to you, but perhaps we can resolve this another way." Vernon laughed harshly. "There is no other way. You're my wife. That paper says you belong to me, and I'm taking you home." His expression darkened. "After I teach you and your lover what happens to those who defy me." He nodded to the third man, who had been quietly moving to the side during their exchange. Before Hayden could react, the man drew his gun and fired. The bullet caught Hayden in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the floor. "Hayden!" Grace screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Blood spread rapidly across his shirt from the wound. Vernon grabbed her arm, yanking her roughly to her feet. "Time to go, Grace." "No," she fought wildly, kicking and clawing. "I won't leave him." One of the other men moved to help Vernon subdue her, gripping her other arm painfully. Hayden struggled to rise, his face pale with pain but his eyes burning with determination. He managed to get to his knees, still clutching his gun. "Let her go," he ordered, his voice strained but steady. Vernon ignored him, dragging Grace toward the door as she continued to struggle. The man who had shot Hayden raised his gun again, aiming for a kill shot this time. "No," Grace screamed, throwing herself against Vernon with all her strength. The sudden movement unbalanced him, sending them both crashing into the gunman just as he fired. The bullet went wild, splintering wood above Hayden's head. In the confusion, Grace broke free and ran back to Hayden. Vernon recovered quickly, his face a mask of fury. He strode toward them, reaching inside his coat for his derringer. "Enough of this," he snarled. "I'll end this right now." But before he could draw his weapon, the front door burst open again. Tommy stood there, rifle raised, with 3 other ranch hands behind him, all armed. "Boss, Miss Grace," Tommy called, taking in the scene with wide eyes. "We heard shooting." Vernon froze, reassessing the odds. 4 armed ranch hands, plus an injured but still armed Hayden against his 3 men. Fury and calculation warred on his face. "This isn't over," he finally said, backing toward the door. "The law's on my side. She's still my wife." "Not for long," Grace said defiantly, helping Hayden to his feet. "The divorce proceedings have already begun, Vernon. Testimony about your abuse has been recorded. You'll never control me again." Vernon's face twisted with hatred. "No court will grant you a divorce without my consent. You're mine until I say otherwise." "Or until death do us part," Hayden said grimly, leaning heavily on Grace but keeping his gun trained on Vernon. "Get off my property before I decide that's the quicker solution." The ranch hands moved in, surrounding Vernon and his men. Outnumbered and outgunned, Vernon had no choice but to retreat. He backed out the door, his men following. "This isn't over," he repeated, his voice promising vengeance. "Not by a long shot." As soon as they were gone, Grace turned her full attention to Hayden's wound. "We need the doctor," she said urgently to Tommy. "And keep men watching to make sure they've truly gone." Tommy nodded and hurried out, barking orders to the other hands. Grace helped Hayden to a chair and quickly cut away his bloody shirt to examine the wound. "It went through clean," she said with relief, pressing a cloth against both entry and exit wounds to stem the bleeding. "But you've lost a lot of blood." Hayden's face was ashen, but his eyes remained clear and focused on her face. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" Grace shook her head, tears filling her eyes at his concern for her even in his injured state. "I'm fine, but you could have been killed." "Worth the risk," he murmured, his hand finding hers despite his weakness. "I meant what I said, Grace. You're everything to me." Dr. Jensen arrived an hour later, confirming Grace's assessment that the bullet had passed through cleanly without hitting bone or major blood vessels. He cleaned and bandaged the wound, leaving strict instructions for rest and care to prevent infection. As night deepened, the ranch hands organized watches, ensuring Vernon wouldn't return undetected. Grace refused to leave Hayden's side, setting up a chair beside his bed where she could monitor him through the night. "You need to rest too," Hayden protested weakly as she bathed his forehead with a cool cloth. "I'll rest when I know you're out of danger," she replied. "Besides, I couldn't sleep anyway, not after." She trailed off, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. Vernon had found her, had forced his way in with violence, would have killed Hayden and dragged her away if not for the timely arrival of Tommy and the others. "He'll come back," she whispered, voicing her fear, "with more men next time." Hayden's fingers closed weakly around hers. "We'll be ready," he promised. "And we'll fight this legally too. There has to be a way to expedite the divorce given what happened tonight." Grace nodded, trying to take comfort in his words, but Vernon's confidence about the law being on his side troubled her. In 1876, a wife had few legal rights apart from her husband. Divorce was difficult in the best of circumstances, nearly impossible without the husband's consent, yet she refused to surrender to despair. Somehow, they would find a way forward together. They had to. Hayden's recovery progressed steadily over the next week. The wound showed no signs of infection, and his strength returned more quickly than Dr. Jensen had predicted. Grace rarely left his side, caring for him tenderly and sharing quiet conversations that deepened their bond further. Meanwhile, ranch operations continued under the capable leadership of the foreman, with Tommy stepping up to take on additional responsibilities. The young man had proven himself not just in the crisis with Vernon, but in the days that followed, showing maturity beyond his years. 10 days after the shooting, Hayden was well enough to sit on the porch, enjoying the crisp November air while Grace knitted beside him. A rider approached from town, one of the hands returning from delivering mail and picking up supplies. "Rider coming," Grace said, setting aside her knitting. Hayden straightened in his chair, wincing slightly at the pull on his healing wound. "Just Lewis," he said, recognizing the ranch hand. "Probably returning from town." Lewis dismounted and approached the porch, pulling an envelope from his saddlebag. "Letter for you, boss, from that lawyer in Dallas. Said it was urgent." Hayden took the envelope, opening it carefully. Grace watched his face as he read, trying to gauge whether the news was good or bad. His expression remained neutral until he reached the end, when a slow smile spread across his features. "What is it?" Grace asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Hayden handed her the letter. "Judge Sullivan is willing to hear our case immediately. Apparently, Vernon's violent intrusion here has raised enough concern that he's expediting the process. We're to appear in Dallas next Wednesday." Hope surged in Grace's heart, only to be tempered by caution. "What are our chances? Vernon seemed so certain no court would grant a divorce without his consent." "Sullivan has a reputation for fairness," Hayden replied, "and for having little patience with men who abuse their wives. I can't promise anything, but this is the best opportunity we could have hoped for." "Then we'll take it," Grace said decisively. "We'll go to Dallas and fight with everything we have." The journey to Dallas the following Wednesday was tense. Grace wore her best dress, navy blue, with modest white trim that Hayden had purchased for her in town. Hayden, still moving carefully due to his healing wound, wore a formal suit that made him look more like a businessman than a rancher. The courthouse was imposing, a solid stone building in the center of town. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation as they were directed to a wood-paneled courtroom where several people already waited. Vernon sat at one table with a slick-looking lawyer beside him. He glared at Grace as she entered but made no move toward her. Their own lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, met them at the door. "Judge Sullivan will hear arguments today and likely render a decision by week's end," he informed them in a low voice. "We have witnesses ready to testify about Mr. Marsh's character and treatment of you, Mrs. Marsh, including the doctor who treated you after the incident at the ranch." "Miss Keller," Grace corrected firmly. "I no longer use his name." Abernathy nodded in understanding. "Of course. Let's proceed." The hearing was grueling. Vernon's lawyer argued passionately that Grace had abandoned her marital duties without cause, that she was mentally unstable, and that she had engaged in adultery with Hayden. He painted Vernon as a concerned husband merely trying to reclaim his wayward wife. When it was Grace's turn to testify, she rose on shaky legs but spoke with clear conviction. She detailed the abuse she had suffered, the isolation Vernon had forced upon her, and her legitimate fear for her life that had driven her to flee. As she spoke, she avoided looking at Vernon, focusing instead on the judge's thoughtful face. "And your relationship with Mr. Prescott?" Vernon's lawyer asked during cross-examination, his tone insinuating. "Mr. Prescott has been my employer and protector," Grace answered steadily. "He offered me honest work and a safe place to live when I had nothing. He has treated me with more respect in 8 months than Mr. Marsh showed in 3 years of marriage." "But you live in his house, unchaperoned," the lawyer pressed. "Are you expecting this court to believe your relationship remains entirely proper?" Before Grace could answer, Judge Sullivan intervened. "The nature of their current relationship is not relevant to the question of whether Mrs. Marsh had legitimate grounds to flee her husband's home. Please confine your questions to that matter, Counselor." The lawyer backed down, but not before casting a knowing look at the jury of local businessmen who would help determine the case. Hayden testified next, describing how Grace had arrived at his ranch, the signs of abuse he had observed, and Vernon's violent intrusion that had resulted in Hayden being shot. His testimony was straightforward and dignified, earning nods of approval from several jury members. Dr. Jensen confirmed the nature of Hayden's wound and also testified about the fading bruise he had observed around Grace's eye when he first met her. Tommy spoke about Vernon's threatening behavior and how the ranch hands had been forced to defend their home and employer. Finally, to Grace's surprise, an elderly woman she didn't recognize was called to testify. She introduced herself as Mrs. Alina Winters, a neighbor of the Marshes in St. Louis. "I lived next door to the Marshes for the duration of their marriage," she stated firmly. "At first, everything seemed normal, but within weeks, I began to hear sounds no decent person should ignore: shouting, things breaking, and sometimes—" She paused, her voice softening, "sometimes a young woman crying in pain." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes at this unexpected validation. Someone had heard, someone had known. "Did you ever intervene, Mrs. Winters?" Abernathy asked gently. "Once," the woman replied, glancing apologetically at Grace. "I saw her in the garden with a blackened eye she tried to hide with a bonnet. I asked if she needed help. She said no, but her hands were shaking so badly she dropped her gardening shears. After that, she wasn't allowed in the garden anymore when Mr. Marsh wasn't home." She straightened her shoulders. "When I heard she'd gone missing, I prayed she'd found safety. I couldn't bear to think of the alternative. As the testimony concluded, Judge Sullivan announced he would consider all evidence and deliver his ruling the following morning. Grace and Hayden spent a restless night at Dallas's best hotel, where Hayden had insisted on getting separate rooms to avoid any appearance of impropriety that might damage their case. The next morning, they returned to the courthouse. Grace felt sick with anxiety, knowing that her entire future hung on one man's decision. Hayden stayed close beside her, his presence a comfort even though he couldn't hold her hand in public. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Sullivan entered. He was an imposing figure with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through pretense. "I have considered all testimony in this difficult case," he began, his voice grave. "The institution of marriage is sacred, not to be dissolved lightly. However, it is equally true that marriage vows include the promise to love, honor, and cherish obligations that fall on both husband and wife." He looked directly at Vernon. "Mr. Marsh, the evidence strongly suggests you have violated these sacred obligations through acts of physical cruelty and imprisonment. This court cannot condone such behavior, regardless of a husband's legal rights over his wife." Hope bloomed in Grace's chest as the judge continued. "It is therefore the finding of this court that Grace Keller Marsh has legitimate grounds for divorce on the basis of extreme cruelty. The divorce is hereby granted." A sob of relief escaped Grace before she could stop it. Beside her, Hayden released a long breath, his hand finding hers under the table and squeezing tightly. Vernon shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. You can't silence," Judge Sullivan ordered sharply. "The ruling stands. Furthermore, Mrs. Marsh, Miss Keller now shall retain any personal property currently in her possession, and Mr. Marsh is ordered to stay a minimum of 100 yards from her person at all times. Violation of this order will result in arrest and imprisonment." Vernon's face contorted with rage, but his lawyer pulled him back into his seat, whispering urgently in his ear. The judge concluded the proceedings, and people began to file out of the courtroom. "We should leave quickly," Abernathy advised in a low voice, "before Mr. Marsh has time to create a scene." They hurried from the courthouse, Hayden's hand at the small of Grace's back guiding her through the crowd. Once outside, Grace finally allowed her emotions to surface, tears of relief streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. Truly over. Hayden wanted nothing more than to take her in his arms, but they were still in public view. "Let's get back to the ranch," he said instead. "We can celebrate properly there." Their journey home was jubilant, both of them giddy with the knowledge that Grace was finally, legally free. The ranch hands had been anxiously awaiting their return, and a cheer went up when Tommy spotted them approaching and called out the good news. That evening, after a celebratory dinner with the entire ranch staff, Hayden and Grace finally found themselves alone on the porch swing. The stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine from the distant hills. "I have something for you," Hayden said, reaching into his pocket. He produced a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple but beautiful gold ring set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's. I've been carrying it since the day you agreed to marry me when you were free." Grace's heart swelled with love as he took her hand. "Grace Keller," he said formally, his eyes never leaving hers. "Now that nothing stands between us, I'm asking you properly, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Not because I want to own you or control you, but because I love you and want to build a life of partnership and respect with you." "Yes," Grace whispered, tears of joy filling her eyes. "With all my heart, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face gently in his hands. "May I?" he asked, still giving her the choice, still respecting her boundaries. In answer, Grace leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Tommy serving as best man and the kindly Mrs. Jensen, the doctor's wife, standing up for Grace. The ranch hands constructed an arbor of evergreen boughs and winter berries, where the couple exchanged their vows before family and friends. "I promise to cherish and respect you," Hayden vowed, his voice clear and strong. "To be your partner in all things, to support your dreams as my own, and to create a home of safety and love for as long as we both shall live." "I promise to trust in your love," Grace replied, no longer afraid to give her heart completely. "To stand beside you in good times and difficult ones, to share your burdens and your joys, and to build our future together with love, respect, and hope for all our days." As Hayden leaned down to kiss his bride, he raised his hand to cup her face. For an instant, a shadow of memory crossed Grace's features, a reflexive flinch before she could stop herself. Hayden noticed and lowered his hand slowly, his eyes full of understanding. "Never again," he whispered for her ears alone. "You will never have reason to fear a raised hand in our home. I promise you that." Grace smiled through happy tears, the last shadows of her past falling away as she stood on tiptoe to meet her husband's kiss, trusting completely in the love and safety she had found at last. The years that followed brought the joy and partnership they had promised each other. The Prescott Ranch prospered under their joint care, Grace transforming the main house into a true home, while also keeping the books with a sharp eye for detail. Hayden expanding their operations with thoughtful innovation that earned respect throughout Texas. In the spring of 1878, their family grew with the birth of their son, William Hayden Prescott, a strong boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. 2 years later, they welcomed twins Rebecca Grace and Robert Thomas, who brought equal measures of joy and chaos to the household. Through the seasons of their life together, the abundant harvests and the lean years, the expansions and the setbacks, the celebrations and the challenges, Hayden kept his promise. Grace never again flinched at her raised hand, because she knew with absolute certainty that in her husband's arms she had found not just love, but the safety and respect that made that love a true partnership of equals. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and they sat together on the porch swing watching the Texas stars, Grace would sometimes touch the small scar on Hayden's shoulder, the permanent reminder of the day he had risked everything to protect her. In that touch was a world of gratitude for the man who had shown her that love, true love, was not about possession or control, but about freedom, respect, and the courage to trust again.